Welcome, everyone. It's my joy and privilege to be a co-sponsor of this event as the rector of the Angelicum, Father Thomas Joseph White. I know that many of you are immediately from our university, but we have the joy to welcome many of you also here as guests in this amazing and dramatic moment in the life of the Roman Church. It's our great joy to have with us this evening Aid to the Church in Need and its USA President, George Marlin, who will shortly after me introduce the speaker this evening. I just want to say that the mission of Aid to the Church in Need and all that you all do here with your staff, your executive director, your president from the USA who are here, is of complete spiritual, let's say, harmony with the legacy and witness of our greatest 20th century alumnus, Pope John Paul II, who was such a unique historical voice of sanctity and of natural political truth and fortitude and courage in speaking for those who witness to the truth in the face often of 20th and 21st century regimes that either from motivations that are religious or anti-religious, fail to uphold the dignity of the human person, the right to religious freedom, the sanctity even of the intellectual conscience in its respect for religious truth, search for the religious truth. So, we feel that you all are obviously performing an invaluable service to the church, and this is a kind of, we would say, sacred spiritual soil for a place to do it, the very room in which John Paul II defended his thesis on the life of faith according to John of the Cross, understood in a Thomistic light. We know he was a great mystical thinker and writer, spiritual writer, as well as a great theoretician of the dignity of the human person. So we're happy to continue that legacy in our own teaching and preaching and writing at the Angelicum, and we're happy to have you here with us. So without further ado, I'd like to invite George, if he could kindly come forward. Thank you.
Father, thank you very much, and we're most grateful for co-hosting with us this event tonight. There's Father Murray, television star. Okay. On behalf of Aid to the Church in Need, first of all, let me welcome you all here tonight. For those of you not familiar with us, Aid to the Church in Need was founded in 1948 by a Dutch Norbertine by the name of Father Werenfried van Straten at the behest of Pius XII. It began as a one-man band. He was known as the Bacon Priest because they literally traveled through Eastern Europe on the dark side of the Iron Curtain with a wheelbarrow handing out bacon to starving people. During the Cold War, it became a large organization. In the post-Cold War period, it grew around the world that we have 24 offices around the world. We give away every dime we have to persecuted and suffering Christians. Last year, we funded 5,000 projects to the tune of about 150 million euros. I'll give you an example. On Sunday morning, when I arrived in Rome, I had breakfast with Archbishop Boris Gudziak, who is the Metropolitan of the United States Ukrainian Greek Church, formerly the Archbishop of Paris. But with us was the Patriarch of the Ukrainian Church. And he and Archbishop Gudziak, were both scholarship kids of Aid to the Church in Need. And many of the Third World seminarians here in Rome at the Angelicum are also scholarship kids of ACN. Every priest in Ukraine, for example, received scholarships from Aid to the Church in Need. And when the Iron Curtain fell, at the behest of John Paul II, Aid to the Church in Need funded 150 million of projects in Ukraine to build the university, the first Catholic university ever in Lviv, which was built by then Father Gudziak, the seminary there, the Theological Institute, the Icon Institute. So fortunately, none of that's been destroyed yet because it's in the western part of the country. But since this war began, we have been giving stipends. We've given about 35 million thus far in this war, but we've been helping out the nuns and priests who have lost their rectories, their convents, don't have an income coming in, so we have been providing them with income in order to survive. And we've done similar things in the Middle East in recent years during the height of ISIS. When they destroyed most of the church, we've helped rebuild that, not only rebuild churches, but homes. So we've done a great deal of humanitarian work. We do stuff behind the bamboo curtain, which I can't talk about in China, but we've been helpful to the underground church there. So we have done, about a year or so ago, Cardinal Dolan came to me. By the way, he sends his apologies. He was supposed to be here this evening, but there's a few other things going on that have kept him busy. So he said, you'd understand. But he came to me and said he had some Cuban nuns that came to see him. And they needed SUVs to get around the mountains of Cuba. And he said, they say it's going to cost $500,000. I don't know how to get it there, because he's head of the International Catholic Charities. So we were able to do it at half the price because we have a network all over and got them their SUVs to the tune of $250,000. So that's the kind of work we've been doing since the 40s. And in the United States, I'm happy to say we've had great success in fundraising there. So ACN has contributed a lot to the church, and hopefully will continue to do that in the future. After the founding ended, we became a papal charity. So we come under the auspices of the Vatican. I'm appointed by way of the Vatican. Cardinal Piacenza is the president of ACN. But again, we've had phenomenal years in Ukraine, the Middle East, has given us the ability to raise a great deal of money and to provide all those persecuted Christians with help in rebuilding their homes and rebuilding the church and rebuilding the schools and hospitals. So I'm happy to say we had great success, and I know many of the students here today have received scholarships from ACN. On that note, I'll finish the commercial, but we are very pleased to sponsor this book here by Dr. Robert Royal. Dr. Royal has been, if you don't have one, please grab one at the end of the evening. Dr. Royal and I have been friends since 1986 and have collaborated on many things over the years, but he wrote a book, as you may know, on the Catholic martyrs of the 20th century at the behest of John Paul II, and presented him with a copy of the book. So we approached him and said, if we can fund your research, can you do the 21st century? And this is the end product here. Dr. Royal is the president of the Faith and Reason Institute, Washington, D.C., which just celebrated its 25th anniversary. He is also the founder, he, myself, the late Ralph McInerney, Michael Novak, founded the CatholicThing.org, which is a daily publication. If you've seen it, I have not seen it, I recommend you look it up. That has been a tremendous success. We started that in 2008, at the presidential election at that time. So Dr. Royal has been a great force in Washington for the church. He is the author of a dozen books on Dante, Catholic intellectuals of the United States, and various other books. But the Martyrs has become a specialty to him. And so we're very pleased this book has been completed. We're going to have a number of events in the United States in the coming weeks, so I'm glad you're here. And on that happy note, I will give you Dr. Royal.
Well, thank you very much, George. As George said, we've been friends for 40 years, and it's been quite a momentous 40 years doing a lot of different things together. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank George and thank Sarkis Bojalian, who's not here because he broke his ankle, and on top of it he got pneumonia, and it slowed him down a little, so he wasn't able to come here this evening. I'm also delighted that my friend, the Rettore Magnifico of this institution, is here this evening. We knew each other back in Washington as well, and I'm a third order Dominican, so I'm always happy to visit Dominican institutions. I also want to commend all of you who are here. George was worried that given the competition with what's going on in this city, that no one would show up tonight. And I said to him, don't worry, it's Rome. People, they're late, but they'll I don't know if they still use this phrase in Italian, but when I was studying Italian many years ago, people used to talk about small groups and they would say, siamo pochi ma buoni. There are just a few of us, but we're good. So thank you all for coming out, and especially because this is not a subject that everyone finds entertaining, to say the least. The idea of how many people around the world on every continent except the Antarctic, as far as I'm aware, there may even be some there because of the way that things are falling out in our world, but the idea of people being persecuted and murdered for the Catholic faith is something that not many people know about to begin with. I know that in this room a lot more people would know that. And secondly, they're in fact all that interested in it. And I want to talk a bit about that before we're done this evening. But I also want to encourage you to look into these lives with a certain perspective. When I did the first book on the 20th century martyrs that George talked about, I did give a copy to John Paul on May 7, 2000. I gave just dozens of lectures, of course, about that, and lots of people were interested in. John Paul wanted to record all the Christian martyrs of the 20th century. So there was a big event at the Colosseum here in Rome in May 2000, which included Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants, and others. The interesting thing about where we are right now, I can almost kind of give you a brief summary of the difference between martyrdom then and the difference between martyrdom now by talking a little bit about these two books. Now, Nietzsche says somewhere that every idea has its autobiography, and maybe that's true, and maybe it's not, but the way that these two books came to be, at least in my own life, I think is quite indicative of where martyrdom is these days. Here's just one fact. I finished writing this new book in 2024, November of 2024. Since then, it's about 6 months, more or less, we can say. Since then, we know that just in Nigeria, Nigeria has produced reliably 5,000 dead Christians every year for the past few years. So taking that as a baseline, we could say probably that at least since I stopped writing, something on the order of 2,000 to 2,500 Christians have been killed in Nigeria alone. And that's not the only place where things like this happen. But I want to say this at the outset. I gave dozens of lectures about the previous book, and a woman asked me in the question and answer session after one of those lectures, weren't you depressed reading about all these people who had been persecuted and killed and how widespread it was in the 20th century? And I looked at her and I said, you know, it never crossed my mind that actually reading about these people was inspiring. I'd never spent so much good time with good people as I did actually reading into those lives of people who were martyred. And not just martyred, but forgave the people who were about to kill them, prayed for them, very rarely apostatized. So the perspective, I think, that for all of us to have about this enduring witness in the modern world that almost no one cares about. We do in this room, I'm sure, all of us. But the perspective to have is that this is also a great beacon of hope. That people are still willing to suffer and die for the faith of Jesus Christ, and they do it in large numbers everywhere around the world, despite knowing what they are facing. Now, when I did the first book, I'll be very brief about this. It was quite easy to go look back at the 20th century because by the end of the 20th century, we had a pretty good historical idea of what had happened in terms of Christians being persecuted and killed. And although it pained several secular readers of my book to hear this, most of it was done by communism, which is to say atheistic, a kind of an atheistic imperialism, right? There also were large numbers of people, of course, killed by the Nazis, killed by fascism, but it was primarily this kind of atheist alternative to what had historically been the basis on which people in the West had lived, that produced the largest crop of martyrs in the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact countries, China. It's still going on in China, although the Chinese have wised up and they're very careful about not appearing to create martyrs, but they do. They basically kidnap bishops and others who sometimes use the term from Latin America that they are disappeared, and no one knows what happens to them, but we can kind of guess. So we had a history that I was able to dig back into, and we could tell that the alternative to religion, the totalitarianism, the secular totalitarianism that always seeks to replace religion, was the major cause of persecution and death of Christians in the 20th century. All that, of course, was before 9/11. So when George asked me if I would go back and produce a second edition of that previous book, it took us about 5 minutes, I think, to realize it was a much better idea to just write a new book from scratch and to look at what the difference is in this first quarter of the 21st century. Because what we have right now is a successor to those totalitarian movements. And let me just quote someone from a Muslim country. I'm sure several of you know of Salman Rushdie, who is a novelist who writes, I think, a kind of a Pakistani British novelist who writes postmodern novels, and was threatened with a fatwa by the Ayatollah Khomeini back in the 1990s because he wrote a novel called The Satanic Verses, in which he portrays the prophet as accepting verses that maybe belong in the Quran or maybe are apocryphal, but in any event seem to portray the prophet as accepting polytheism. So this made him a hunted figure all over the world. Fortunately for him, he was living in England at the time, and Margaret Thatcher was a very strong leader, and British security forces protected him. But 30 years later, he was stabbed in Chautauqua, New York, while he was giving a presentation. He lost one eye. And this is what he said afterwards. Let me just look at my text here, and I want to quote this exactly. He said, I'm quoting now, "After having overcome fascism, Nazism, and Stalinism, the world now faces a new totalitarian global threat, Islamism." Now, most Muslims, as we all know, are basically peaceful people. But as uncomfortable as it is for us to have to say this in the modern West, because we all try to live and let live and get along with one another. We believe in religiously pluralistic societies. This is a specific problem that we have to face head on that isn't simply driven by politics, it isn't driven by economics, it isn't even driven by cultural features, it's driven by theology, by a theological difference in Islamism. There's a drive in several parts of the world right now to create a global caliphate. I'm sure you all know what a caliphate is. It's going to be a kind of a Muslim empire. And it doesn't accept the Western categories of things such as human rights or the right of innocent, what we regard as innocent people not to be killed because of conflicts of religion. I'll come back to that later, but I just want to give you that earlier on. So let me get into our subject more deeply right now. And I want to start with something that may seem obvious, but I want to just for a minute reflect on what the word martyr means in a Christian context. Because there are Muslims who claim to be martyrs for that caliphate that I was just talking about, right? An American magazine tried to claim just last year that there were Christian martyrs who killed themselves in the early church. This is not true. Christian martyrs never kill themselves out of a desire to spread the faith. They're almost always killed because of forces on the outside that want to stamp out what Christianity is and the people who practice it. So the term I'm sure that most of us are familiar with in this room is, as in the ancient Roman Empire, and for quite a while, martyrs, Christian martyrs, were killed because of something that is called in Latin, it was in odium fidei, out of hatred for the faith. Now, even there, if you think back on it, the conflict with the Roman Empire was not so much that the Christians didn't believe in the pagan gods, although that was a source of friction. What the real source of friction was to the Roman authorities, that Christianity was becoming an alternative source of authority. So Rome was very sensitive to any factions that might break up that power, that organization that the Roman Empire at its height had. and seems to have disappeared from modern Rome, if I can just say that incidentally. But they recognized that as a social threat and as a political threat, even though it wasn't necessarily so at the time, and they wanted to stamp it out. So we should be aware that even in the question of in hatred of the faith, people aren't necessarily having theological debates that end up in murders. There's always a complex of religious belief, politics, economics, authority, and even personal ambitions that play a role. And if you think about it, even Jesus' own execution manifests all those different elements, right? John Paul II actually added something to that ancient understanding of martyrs. Before we had the celebration of the martyrs in 2000, he brought out some documents trying to identify what he called the nuovi martiri, the new martyrs. And there's a certain type of situation in the modern world that is a bit different from what used to exist in the ancient world. And what he meant by these new martyrs was that a lot of times the way that people are persecuted or they end up being killed is not because of that theological conflict or even necessarily a political conflict. They happen to be in social circumstances that put them at odds with people around them. Now, all of us, I think, probably live lives in which we have some conflict with people around us. But these are circumstances in which people know that what they are doing is going to get them into trouble. And yet they persist in their Christian faith, their Christian activities, in whatever society they find themselves in. The example I like to use about this is, I'm sure a lot of you know that during the Mexican Civil War, the Cristero War in the beginning of the 20th century, something like 300,000 people died, many Christians, because they were repressed by a socialist Mexican government. If I were to ask you today, which is the most dangerous country on earth for a Catholic priest, what would you say? I know what you wouldn't say probably, but it's Mexico. As Catholic as Mexico is, and the fact that the government is not really an anti-clerical government the way it used to be, bishops, priests, lay church workers in Mexico are under threat, this time not from the government, not from a political ideology, totalitarianism, but from criminality. So it's the drug traffickers, the human traffickers. In Mexico now there is even this unfortunate phenomenon known as Santa Muerte. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this, but she's sort of a demonic figure of the Virgin Mary. It's a woman who the gangs and the cartels and even some of our criminals in Los Angeles pray to. And she's kind of this spiritual figure who opposes the Catholic Church and particularly opposes priests and bishops and others who oppose the criminal activities that are being carried out. And so we, as odd as it is for us to see this, there are something like 9 or 10 Catholic priests who are murdered in these criminal contexts every year, along with other Catholics as well. And something somewhat similar happens in places like Colombia and Peru, and also Haiti. Haiti is a place of great chaos, and so that chaos even extends to religious workers in a country like that. So those are the kind of the new martyrs. They're not so much the victims of totalitarianism as they are of being a witness in a situation where witnessing can be dangerous, but you persist in that witness. Now, there's a third category that Francis added to these first two. We had in odium fidei, and then we have these nuovi martiri. Francis, a few years ago, began to talk about what he called, let me put this simply, it's a Latin phrase that he came up with called oblatio vitae, the offering of your life, okay? It has some similarities with the other two categories, and maybe if I can get this to work, I can show you an example of one of these people. Yes, here it is, Akash Bashir. Somebody who practices oblatio vitae in the documents that Francis has published is a person who isn't necessarily like a priest in Mexico, putting his life on the line in the sense of, on a day-by-day basis, living in opposition to evil, criminality, to cartels, whatever it might be. The offering of life that Francis is talking about is, we can almost kind of call it a spur of the moment thing, that the people who he regards as in that category generally, of course, have the reputation of having good moral lives. They live good lives in their community, but a moment pops up and they're willing to die rather than abandon the faith or allow people to damage the faith. And Akash Bashir, I'm glad that I was able to get this picture of him. He's a rather interesting figure. He's a young Catholic in Lahore in Pakistan. And on March 15, 2015, which happened to be Laetare Sunday for that Lent, an Islamist suicide bomber tried to enter the St. John Church in Lahore. And Amash Bashir was outside and was kind of loosely a security guard. Well, he saw the person coming in with a suicide vest, grabbed him, and we're told that his last words were, "I'm going to die, but you will not go in." So here's a person in an extremely anti-Catholic environment in Pakistan who, on the spur of the moment, has got this moment of either offer his life or allow a person to go in and kill maybe, who knows, 150 worshippers on Laetare Sunday, and makes that decision right then and there to die rather than allow the faith to be damaged. And that's what Francis is talking about in this sense of oblatio vitae. I've got another figure I just want to show, because this will help us understand some of these particularities. Here's an Italian who's I think is quite remarkable. Some of you may know of this figure, Rosario Livatino, who was a lawyer in Sicily. There were a couple cases of this sort of thing in the 20th century as well, but he was a lawyer. He was a very, very fervent Catholic, and he was very talented as a lawyer, so he quickly rose up in the ranks and he became a judge, and he pursued the mob, the mafia, in Sicily with great success, and I must say with great courage as well. And as often happens in these cases, there are less Catholic tinted cases like this, but he was really a person who openly spoke about the fact that he was doing what he did because he believed in law and order. He was a lawyer, a trained lawyer, he was a judge, but also because he believed that God wanted there to be good order in a place even like Sicily, and he was willing to put his life on the line for it. So I brought him just because he's a local boy in a sense, and there are other cases like this of mobsters trying to assassinate priests just for reasons that they resist one thing or another locally. We should be aware of them because these don't really, I think most of us, unless we dig into this and study it, don't really recognize that there is this type of threat to human life and to Christianity in our world as well. But let's go on. I've got 3 chapters in my book about the Middle East. And of course, as I said, after 9/11, the Middle East is a place where we see most of the Christian martyrdom taking place, although it's also migrated into Central Africa, as I'm sure several of you know. It's migrated out to the Far East, the Southeast. And there's an interesting, I think there's an interesting framework for why it is that so many deaths of Christians started to happen in the Middle East in the beginning of the 21st century. Just a little bit of quick history. You probably know that after World War II, the Ottoman Empire, which was called the sick man of Europe for a long time, collapsed, actually collapsed in 1922, and that left a power vacuum. There were lots of people who were trying to organize the Arabs in those various states that the Ottoman Empire had ruled over. The Ottomans were not Arabs, they were Turks. And so they ruled over a largely Muslim population with also a large percentage of Christians. As we know, there were large percentages of Christians in Syria and in Iraq. Lebanon, what now is called Lebanon, was probably about 80% Christian when the Ottoman Empire collapsed. So there were significant Christians who lived uneasy lives during the long history of the Ottoman Empire, but basically were tolerated. One of the reasons they were tolerated is that they paid a tax for being Christians, and the Ottomans needed money, and this was a kind of a steady source of income for them at the same time. But when they collapsed, there was no order that followed. If you've ever read T.E. Lawrence's The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, or you've seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, I just rewatched it. It's a wonderful, heroic kind of story. He tried to help there become a pan-Arab state created in the Middle East, and it didn't work, of course. And it's probably a good thing that it didn't work. But what happened instead was that the French and the British established these mandates, these sort of territories that they tried to keep order over. The French had Lebanon, and they had Syria. The British had Palestine and Iraq and Jordan, those three countries primarily. But that couldn't last forever. And then what happened is, as the so-called colonial forces pulled back, you got all these strong men, you got these clashes of different tribes in these countries, and the situation of Christians in those countries became extremely perilous. Lebanon is I think, really a heart-rending place, because here's a place that was 80% Christian. Everyone kind of thought of it as the Riviera of the Middle East when it set out in the 1960s. And there even was an arrangement in the Lebanese constitution that the highest offices would be distributed among different religious groups. So there would be a Maronite Christian who would be the president. I think a Sunni Christian would be the vice president. The Speaker of the Parliament would be a Shia Muslim. And then the Deputy Speaker would be an Orthodox Christian. So it really set out, even in the founding documents, to have a kind of an ecumenical, pluralistic system. Well, of course, we know now, today, Lebanon is often in the news, and what happened is that Hezbollah, which is an Islamist movement with backing from Iran, has insinuated itself not only into the government, but into the military, into the educational system, into the culture as a whole. And Christians, more than ever, are at peril in this country that once was kind of a beacon. But when Benedict XVI went to Lebanon a few years ago, he said that Lebanon can't fail. Lebanon is the place where we really had some hope that it would be possible to live in the Middle East. And of course, it hasn't worked out the way that he thought. Now, as I'm sure several of you know, the way that Islamist radicalism developed was through several major figures. And probably the most important at the beginning was Sayyid Qutb, who was an Egyptian, who started to develop the ideology of Islamism, of radical Islamism, of the seeking of a caliphate. Not many people know this, but Sayyid Qutb came to the United States and was horrified by the morals that people showed in the United States, the way men and women were with one another. This was in 1948 through 1950. Those of you who know America know that that was quite a different America than the America. If he were to come to the United States today, you almost have to wonder what would happen. But there were many figures like him who began to develop this ideology. And it spread throughout the Middle East. It's not like even the rulers in the Middle East liked this ideology, and Qutb himself was Egyptian. He went back to Egypt and was executed by the Egyptian government. But it moved everywhere. It moved people like Osama bin Laden, who was the mastermind behind 9/11, which blew up the World Trade Center. Now, I want to look just quickly at Iraq, because after the coalition forces went into Iraq after 9/11 and weren't able to control the situation there very much, that's another country in which Christians very quickly started to be in peril. Let me bring up a couple of other pictures for you. Here's a very interesting priest, Father Agib Gandhi, who, by the way, studied at this institution, paid for by Aid to the Church in Need. And he was one of these priests, we all know this type of priest, who was just, he had this outgoing personality. He was very bright. He came here and studied, I think finished a PhD in ecumenical theology, and then went back to Iraq knowing that he was stepping into a place that he said was like hell because of the lack of order in the society. So he got a parish in the Mesopotamian area, which is a longtime Christian area. He became the secretary to the bishop. His bishop who is here, Bishop Paulus Farara. His bishop was also martyred during this period of chaos. But they stayed. And Raghib Ghani had many opportunities to go to Switzerland. He was very well liked in Ireland. He was very well liked here in Italy. But he started to be threatened. He would get bullets mailed to him in the mail. Random people would come up to him on the street and say, "You must close your church. You don't belong here in our newly Islamist Iraq." And he would say, I can't close the house of God. I'm going to remain. He wouldn't leave the country. So sadly, and one of the repetitions of many types of deaths like this, he was shot down with 3 of his bodyguards. His mother said afterward that he told her that he was going to die, but he wasn't going to abandon his people. And his bishop underwent the same thing. He was kidnapped and was held hostage for a couple of weeks. 3 of his bodyguards were killed. His bishop was in the trunk of a car when he was kidnapped and actually got his cell phone out somehow and was able to call back to his diocese and say, "Don't pay the ransom. Use that money for the poor people of the diocese. Don't use it to free me." And so he also died. There are many other terrible stories about that time in Iraq. A priest being killed in the confessional while they're trying to absolve people of their sins, and many other sort of random situations. Now, let me just bring up another interesting figure, because we could obviously this type of thing we could do multiple times. Here's an interesting figure, a woman, religious sister Leonela Sgorbati, obviously Italian. She has a connection with Raghib Ghani because it was actually in the weeks. You remember the lecture that Pope Benedict gave at Regensburg, in which it was kind of a misreading of what he said, and maybe it wasn't the wisest thing for him to do, but he talked about a conversation between an Orthodox Christian and a Muslim leader back in the 15th century, in which he talked about, and it was actually directed against us in the East, in the West, that he talked about how there can't be force in religion, that religion is actually a reality of reason, of logic, of knowledge. Well, in the Muslim world, you'll recall, a lot of people thought that this was a slap against a former Muslim leader. There were riots in a variety of places. Father Ghani partly was probably assassinated because of the fallout from that. And Sister Leonela Sgorbati, who was a nurse and had actually set up a school to train nurses in Somalia, was also threatened multiple times. Like all these martyrs, decided to remain there and was martyred herself when she was coming back from the nursing school one day back to her residence. Very kind of tragic thing. She was really a kind of a large-hearted woman. Right, here we go. Give me a minute, I'm almost there. Oop. Now, I put this one in because I'm American, and I thought I should have at least one American in the list of the people that I talk about. This is James Foley. I don't know if he qualifies as a martyr under those 3 categories, but I find him an intriguing character. He was a devout Catholic American. He went to Marquette University, which is in Wisconsin. And when he graduated, he became a journalist, photojournalist. And he told his mother that he became a journalist because as a Catholic, he wanted to document what really happens in war. Now, this is, as I say, this is sort of that Nuovi Martiri, where people are carrying out what you could almost half call a secular work, but at the same time, they're doing it for a religious reason. So he goes to Libya when Libya is collapsing. He gets arrested by the forces there, by the Islamist forces. He spends just a short while in prison, in custody. But his Catholic faith really comes out strongly at that moment. He begins to pray more deeply, and it really sustains him during his captivity. But then he's released. And then what happens? he goes to Syria, and he's picked up again. This time, I think he spent something like 10 or 11 months in jail, praying intensely during that time, and eventually has his throat slit because of the identity of him as a journalist and as a Westerner and as a Christian and someone that could not be tolerated. I think this is an interesting kind of case because I wonder how many people in the world fall into this category, which may require us to think even further about what it means to put your life on the line for the faith. But I just wanted to have him in for a minute because I think it's someone that has often been ignored. I want to move now to Africa. Because one of the strange things that happened is, as you probably know, Western forces and other forces basically did away with ISIS, suppressed ISIS in 2016, 2017 period, something like that. And so some degree of order started to return to Syria, to Iraq, etc. But what happened was that the center of the movement moved to Central Africa. So some of the same ideologies that were operative, the Islamist ideologies that were operative in the Middle East, started to show up in Nigeria, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia with Sister Scribati, etc., right in that central area, and also Libya and some other places as well. I bring up this case of Michael Nadi, who was a Nigerian. He was a seminarian and only 20 years old when he was kidnapped by an Islamist group in Nigeria. Nigeria, as you probably know, is about half Christian and half Muslim, and the northern part of Nigeria is mostly Muslim, and the southern part is mostly Christian, and Muslims in the southern and western part are not as radicalized as in the north. But Michael Nadi is picked up as a 20-year-old seminarian, and from what we know afterward is that the Islamists gave him the choice to convert or die. I mean, we often hear that formula. Somebody gets picked up by a radical Islamist and says, convert or die, and you can die right now. Well, he wasn't about to convert. In fact, what he told them is that they were giving a bad example of what it means to be a Muslim. And then he said, and by the way, you should become a Catholic instead. So he was such a brave and obviously brave figure that the person who shot him, who was later arrested in Nigeria, said that he was one of the most remarkable, brave young men that he had ever met. Just a seminarian, 20 years old. Another amazing figure from Central Africa, Father Vincent Machozi. I'm told that in his local dialect, Machozi means son of tears or something like that. Maybe some of you know this language. But Machozi was one of these big-hearted figures as well. And he became an Assumptionist priest. He came to the United States and he actually studied at Boston University. And while he was doing a PhD in Boston University, the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo became so dire that he just said, I can't stay here in safety studying when my people are under threat back in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So he flew back and he set up a network of information about who was being persecuted, what women were being raped, what children were being killed, who was being kidnapped, who was being enslaved, etc. And he would put this online. It's kind of an easier thing to do these days than it was in the past. So he would take out a cell phone or he would take out a camera, and of course he would try to also document who it was that was carrying out these terrible acts against just the kind of average people you see in this photograph where he's back with them. He's elected president of this tribe that he was from at the time. And of course, one thing leads to another, and this is where the story gets less interesting. When I wrote the first book, I had to find different ways to not to keep talking about how people were shot or stabbed or hung or had their throats slit. And I'm sorry to say that the ways in which people can die are just very few, and he was also killed by being shot at the end. But if we want to talk about hope in the world, when he died, 30,000 people showed up at his funeral in Central Africa at a time when probably to do that was to put yourself at risk as well. And I think that kind of heroism has a resonance that we will probably see has good consequences in the future. I've spoken about how the Islamist movement moved to Central Africa, but it also moved to Southeast Asia, which is really quite tragic because most people, when I first started reading about these things back in the late 20th century, most people used to talk about the difference between Islam in the Gulf and Islam in Southeast Asia, where things allegedly were more easygoing. There was kind of a more respect for pluralism. But I quote in the book a Malaysian diplomat who said he remembers growing up as a kid and playing with Christians and other Muslims and Jews and whatnot. And all that has begun to change. I don't want to go into too many details because it just becomes overwhelming, but it's simply the case that in many places now in Southeast Asia where we wouldn't have expected it in the past, the same kind of movement toward a global caliphate with loose but definite ties to movement back in Central Africa and now again back in the Middle East is coming to the fore, even in a country like the Philippines. The Philippines is, 95, 98% Christian, something like that. And yet in the southern Philippines, where there are some Islamist movements, universities have been attacked with suicide bombers, and there have been individuals assassinated. I fear about this because I fear that this is showing itself to be something that is going to be almost impossible to oppose unless we and a lot of other people pay very careful attention to this. Because these things happen in places that are not immediately available to immediate coverage. And so they need to be tracked very, very carefully by those of us who care about these things. I just want to talk briefly about Pakistan. I'm sure several of you know this, Asia Bibi. She was a woman, rather a simple woman in Pakistan who was condemned to death, allegedly, for having insulted Muhammad. In fact, the kind of women she worked with in agricultural context were constantly abusing her, telling her she should become a Muslim, and kind of one day she just kind of lashed out a little bit angrily at them. But they, as often happens in a place like Pakistan, they brought false charges of blasphemy against her. Pakistan is the one place in the world where blasphemy is written right into the Constitution. And if you can prove a case of blasphemy, can actually lead to someone being killed. Well, she became an international cause because so many people knew about her. She's a Catholic. And a very, very sad kind of pattern has emerged in Pakistan where somebody like this gets accused of blasphemy, and the police can't ignore it because riots are taking place. So she's arrested. She's condemned to death in a courtroom. In fact, she was even attacked in the courtroom where she was condemned to death. And then she's taken off to prison. And she spends several years there, and no one really knows what's going to happen. But there's an appeal to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court in Pakistan eventually says, well, there's really a lack of evidence. But this happens over and over again where charges of blasphemy are used to intimidate Christians, sometimes to appropriate their land or their properties or whatever it is. And I think our Western governments really need to pay some careful attention to Pakistan, not only because of her. This is a very interesting man too, Shahbaz Bhatti. From his very earliest youth, Bhatti was a guy who defended all the minorities in Pakistan. He was a Christian too, Catholic. His father and his father was in the British Army when Pakistan and India were one nation. And he grew up in a very strongly Catholic family. His brother was actually a doctor who was studying here in Rome, I think practicing here in Rome. And Bhatti, when the Pakistanis decided that they would have a ministry of minorities, Bhatti was named the first minister for minorities. And he continued, ever since his student days, he'd been defending minorities in the university, in the society, etc. Well, of course, becoming the Minister for Minorities puts you in a very, very visible position. He tried to defend Asia Bibi, and he too was assassinated as a result. Another large-hearted, big figure in a society in which to be that is to put yourself in peril. I just want to talk quickly about two other categories. There's, unfortunately now, in India, a growing kind of Hindu fundamentalism, which is very odd because if you know anything about the history of Hinduism, Hindus are not like Muslims. There is no kind of missionary impulse in Hinduism. It's more or less, right, a religion in which people are attracted, you study. But the government in India right now has been using a kind of a militant form of Hinduism to control people, to intimidate Christians and other minorities. And we see instances that are dangerously like what has already been happening in Pakistan. And I'm sorry to say that because of the position of India in international affairs, this is very little noticed. And there's another place that we really need to spend a lot of energy on. One last little bit. I don't want to abuse your time. The last chapter in my book deals with something that I don't think has ever been dealt with in any similar book, and that is religious repression and martyrdom in Western developed countries. And what I mean by that is, look, I could put up this case. I'm sure everyone here knows the case of Father Jacques Hamel in France. He was saying Mass one morning in a small village in Normandy. Two 19-year-old Muslims who had been radicalized online came in, cut his throat, stabbed a couple of other parishioners who were there. It's said that as he was dying, he said, "Va-t'en, Satan," get out of here, Satan. Pope Francis immediately declared him a martyr. I don't know how, but he declared him a martyr. It must fit in one of the categories somewhere, because he was not really even kind of exposing himself in a dangerous environment. He was retired, he was an older guy. Just happened that day two radicalized Muslims walked in and killed him. But the Pope encouraged people to put up his image, to pray to him and to regard him as a heroic witness to the faith. But he isn't the only one. He's the most notorious one. Just a few weeks later, there were 3 Catholics stabbed at a Mass in Nice. There are all over Europe other stabbings that take place. We know about trucks running through Christmas markets and whatnot. And I have some friends who run this observatory in Vienna, which is called the Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe. Now, for those of us who are English speakers, an observatory is usually what you use to look at the stars, but this observatory is sort of a place where records are kept of hate crimes as defined by the European criteria legally that occur in the various countries of Europe. And when I first started to visit with them a few years ago, they have documented, you can go to the website, it's OIDAC, OIDAC, 700 cases of anti-Christian acts in 2023 here in Europe. And in 2024, there were 800 anti-Christian acts here in Europe. And they take all sorts of different forms, and it isn't always easy to say why it's happening. But it's a combination, I think, of both Islamic radicalism and our own homegrown anti-Christianity. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. There's a case that they documented in Malta, of all places, where a young man who had undergone sexual transition, as we define it now, right? He was a man who trans to become a woman, but then became a born-again Christian and transed back to becoming a man. And so here's a kind of a rare case, although we're starting to see more and more of this in the United States, I imagine here in Europe as well. Well, a local journalist thought this was kind of an interesting phenomenon, so she interviewed him. There was nothing anti-gay about it, there was nothing anti-trans about it. He was just talking about his experience as having been trans, then becoming a Christian, and as a result going back to his original gender, if we want to use that term. Well, he was arrested in Malta for a hate crime. And the journalist who interviewed him was arrested in Malta for a hate crime as well. Now, maybe this is just one of those odd circumstances, but I have a feeling, And this isn't so much tied to the trans question, because I think the trans question is kind of resolving itself rather rapidly, certainly in the UK and maybe in the United States. But I think this is one of those examples of an anti-Christian, homegrown attitude that all of us should be paying a lot of attention to in our various so-called developed, pluralistic, tolerant societies. I'm sure many of you know about the cases in England of that woman who was praying silently outside an abortion clinic, and actually several hundred yards away, and was arrested after a policeman said, "Are you praying?" She said, "Well, maybe." She was arrested for praying silently. A similar case happened of an ex-British Army officer who had had his girlfriend have an abortion like 20 years earlier, and he too was arrested for being hundreds of yards away from an abortion clinic and praying. In Britain, there's a blasphemy case. In the Midlands in England, 3 or 4 schoolboys, non-Muslims, were on their way to a public school. One of them had bought a Quran because he wanted to find out what Muslims believe. And these are 4 guys fooling around on the way to school, and he drops the book by accident. But the rumor gets abroad that he had desecrated the Quran. So the 4 of them had to be suspended from school. There was a great social uprising as a result of this. The principal of the school said it was determined that they hadn't done anything wrong, but out of fear for what even the charge of blasphemy could do in central England, those kids had to be suspended, and there had to be kind of a massaging of the community. This too I find to be a kind of an indication of something that we should all be paying careful attention to. And let me just say, as an American, we've got it in North America as well. Our Catholic bishops in the United States have documented from 2020 to 2024 over 400 cases of arson, desecration of statues, attacks on the tabernacle, 400 in something like 40 different states in the United States of America. Again, by something that I think we have to call our own homegrown anti-Christianity. You may want to dispute with me about this, but I even think that the case in Canada, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but it was said a few years ago that some aerial photography had shown that there were mass graves outside of some government schools that had been run by religious figures, in which it was assumed that somehow those children at these schools, who were mostly Native Americans, sometimes called Indians, first people in Canada, it was assumed that somehow these kids had died because of mistreatment by the religious groups that had been running this school. 30 churches were burned in Canada. Justin Trudeau came out and said, well, burning churches isn't the right thing to do. But it's understandable. This is a very dangerous thing to say, that because people, without proof, are willing to burn Christian churches, and you make an excuse for it. To me, this reflects that there's a kind of an attitude, I think, among our elites. I'm sorry to say this. That Christianity's history is evil. It probably doesn't deserve that much protection anyway. And so, yeah, unfortunately, these things happen sometimes because people were allegedly mistreated in the past, and we'll just have to live with it and go on. I think so widespread is this attitude that you'll probably recall the Pope Francis, went to Canada and apologized for those